What were the 10 most popular DoughRoller podcasts of 2014? And what were the top 10 most popular articles in 2014? And what were my favorite articles and podcasts from the past year? We'll answer these questions and more on this, the 140th episode of the DoughRoller Podcast.
Welcome to the DoughRoller Podcast, where the best thing money can buy is financial freedom. We help you make more, spend less, and invest the rest. And now your host, Rob Berger.
Whether you're just starting out, buried under a mountain of debt, or well on your way to financial freedom, this is the podcast to help you take your finances to the next level. Hey, everybody. Hope you're having a great day. It's the day after Christmas, and my family and I, actually my wife and daughter and I, are going to head out, I think, in a bit and enjoy the day, maybe see a movie. Our son, kind of a sad Christmas in a way for us. He wasn't with us because he's at boot camp in Paris Island, but he's in a good place doing a good thing. And our thoughts and prayers are with him. He will be home in the middle of January, and we're going to keep the tree up for him until he gets home and have sort of a post-celebration, post-Christmas, when he gets home. We're looking forward to that. Hope you're having a great holiday, however you celebrate it. And so today we got something kind of special, a little different as we come to the end of the year. I thought what I would do is actually, it was a recommendation from a listener named Neil, who said, "Are you going to do a best of 2014 show?" And I thought, well, that's a great idea. Why not? And so, Neil, I appreciate the suggestion. And so I've got a number of things planned for today's show. But the goal is to just share with you the best content, blog posts, and podcasts that I produced in 2014, according primarily to all of you. Now, I've got my own personal favorites that I've listed. But I've also got the most of this is coming from you guys in one way or another, and I'll explain how I figured all that out. I wish I could have polled all of you and surveyed and done all of that. I did a little bit of that through the newsletter, although that's sort of tough to do around the holidays because folks, well, you have more important things to do than read my email newsletter and respond to it. But when it's the holidays, but I did get some responses, so we've got that, but a few other things. Before I get to that, I am recording this podcast differently than I've ever recorded any other podcast. So I would really appreciate hearing from you as to the sound quality, what you think of it. You can shoot me an email, dr@doughroller.net, and let me know. Here's what happened. So when I started podcasting, it would have been in November of 2013. I, of course, knew nothing about podcasting in terms of the equipment and setup and how you do it. And so I read a lot of information online. And based on that, I ended up buying, well, frankly, a lot of equipment. I've got this big soundboard, well, big to me. I know they're much larger, but a soundboard here sitting on my desk, and a handheld digital recorder. And I used to record my podcast into that recorder through the soundboard, all these wires going everywhere. Of course, I've got a headset on. I'm talking into a mic that's on a boom and all that sort of thing. And, the digital recorder broke. Just a little over a year old, and it broke, and it's $200. I'm thinking, I do not want to spend $200. So I started doing some more research now, having learned a little bit over the last year, and it turns out that basically I had too much equipment. I just don't need a mixing board and a digital recorder. It doesn't improve, I don't think, you'll let me know, the sound quality. It's a lot more complicated to set up and maintain, and it takes up a lot of room on my desk. So as I record this podcast for the first time, I'm simply recording into GarageBand, which is, if you're a Mac user, you know what GarageBand is. Maybe you do anyway, but it does a lot of things, but it can record podcasts pretty simply right into GarageBand. I can then export it as an MP3 or whatever I want to do. I can do a lot of sound sort of post-production editing if I want. As you probably know, if you've listened for a while, I hate to do post-production editing. I don't mind if you hear some of my mistakes. That's part of life, and hopefully they're not too many. But I wanted to share that with you for a couple of reasons. Again, one, I really want your feedback on the quality of the sound. Let me know what you think. And secondly, it's funny how sometimes, and I'm this way, maybe you are too, I tend to overcomplicate things. And my setup for producing a podcast is a perfect example of that. And I've been trying to simplify everything in my life. It's definitely a process. It's definitely a journey. I don't know that I'll ever arrive, but I've certainly made a lot of progress. And after my recorder broke, I thought, let me look at this. And I'm thinking, well, goodness, I can get rid of that. I don't need to replace it. Maybe it can be repaired. I'm still looking into that. If it can, I'll sell it. I probably don't need this mixing board. If I finally conclude that I don't, I'll sell that as well. I'll make some money. Someone else can put it to good use. Get a good mixing board for certainly a lot less than it would cost retail. And I declutter my workspace. So it's kind of a win-win-win situation. So that's what's going on here at DoughRoller headquarters, so to speak. And again, would really like your input on the quality of the sound. Still working, by the way, on the quality of the sound for interviews. That's a little more complicated because I don't have control over the interviewees' equipment, whether they're on a landline, a cell phone, through Skype, whatever. So there are some limitations there. I'm starting to use what's called Skype Recorder, and I did one interview, which is a really good interview, an important one that I'm looking forward to publishing in about a week and a half. The sound quality was terrible. And it wasn't their fault. It was just me trying to figure all this out. I'm going to do some post-production editing to try to make it as good, the sound quality as best as I can. Still working on that. But anyway, that's what's going on here. Again, appreciate your comments on the quality of the sound. I know that's obviously important for a podcast. So let's get to the main topic, and it is the best of 2014. So here's what I did. I first came up with the top 10 list based simply on the number of downloads. So this obviously relates to podcasts. What were the top 10 downloaded podcasts of the year? So I'm going to walk through those in a minute. Then I'm going to look at the top 10 blog posts based not on downloads, but on actual people coming to the blog itself, DoughRoller.net, and reading the blog posts. Some of those, in fact, most of those are podcasts as well. But a lot of folks, maybe they don't want to listen to a podcast. They prefer to read it. That's fine. Maybe some of you do both. That's fine too. But I have analytics software on the site that tells me how many visitors come to the website generally, as well as by content, by article. So we're gonna list you the 10 most popular blog posts for 2014. Then I'm going to list some of your favorites. A few people emailed in, and I've got 2 or 3 emails there that I want to share with you, including Neil's, who started all of this. It's his fault. Neil, it's your fault. You started all this craziness, so I'm going to read 3. I got 3 email that I'm going to read. And then I'm going to finish off by giving you my personal favorites by month over 2014. All of these, by the way, you will find links to in the show notes to this podcast. This is podcast 140, so the show notes, you know where they are, DoughRoller.net/podcast 140. Now, if I mention a podcast in any of these top 10 lists and whatnot, I will include, of course, the podcast number, so you can go directly to that if you want. But all of these will have links in the show notes, so you can easily find any of these podcasts or blog posts that you may have mentioned. Let me give a quick plug for my newsletter, DoughRoller.net/newsletter. You can sign up. It's free. It goes out once a week on Saturday at 7 p.m. I mention that because in that newsletter, among other things, I include links to all of the articles and podcasts that were published the previous week. That's the easiest way to stay on top of the content that I am doing my best to put out. Hopefully, you're enjoying it and finding it useful. Okay. With all of that said, let's get first to the top 10 podcasts by download. Now, this is just for 2014. Just for 2014. So I excluded any podcasts in November and December of 2013. And I'll go starting with the 10th most downloaded podcast. And this one kind of surprised me only because this is a dense topic. It was podcast 105, the 5-year rule on Roth IRA contributions. You know, if you have a Roth IRA, there are 2 different 5-year rules in terms of, one deals with whether you'll get taxed if you withdraw the money before then. The other one talks about whether you'll get a penalty. And once you wrap your mind around them, they kind of make sense. There's some logic here. You know, the IRS has some reasons for these rules. Sometimes they're a bit hard to decipher, but once you figure it out, it actually makes sense. Hopefully, in podcast 105, dealing with Roth IRA contributions, I laid that out in a way that, hopefully makes sense. That was the 10th most downloaded podcast of 2014. Number 9 was an interview with Stuart Ritter of T. Rowe Price. Which retirement accounts should you withdraw from first? That was podcast 121. Obviously, a very important question if you're in retirement or nearing retirement. We spend all these years saving up in 401ks, IRAs, traditional, Roth, and then taxable accounts. Then you have Social Security. Maybe you have a pension. Maybe you have an annuity. And you hit retirement and, you think, well, finally I get to relax. Well, not exactly. I mean, you spend all these years accumulating. Now we have to figure out what the best way is to actually spend all this money that you've managed to save. Stuart, I really enjoyed that interview. He was just a great guy, a lot of fun. And I thought he did a great job of walking through his thoughts and T. Rowe Price's thoughts on how to withdraw from your retirement accounts. Again, podcast 121. Number 8, 100 ways to improve your finances. You may remember this marathon of a podcast. It was actually episode 100, DoughRoller.net/podcast 100. And I somehow managed to come up with a list of 100 ways to improve your finances. Number 7, should you save for a down payment or invest for retirement? These kind of questions come up all the time. How do we prioritize competing financial goals, whether it's, in this case, a down payment or saving for retirement? A lot of times it deals with how you should prioritize your debt and what's the best way to do that. Even within the context of debt, sometimes the question is, which debt should you pay off first? You just have to encounter these questions. We encounter them regularly. And so in that podcast, I did my best to try to answer that question. That was podcast 120. All right, number 6, tools to track your net worth. This was podcast 114. I love, tools generally, financial tools, retirement calculators, ability to track your investments. In this case, we looked at tools to track your net worth, podcast 114. Whatever you do, I think this is, in terms of sort of keeping score. To me, the net worth statement, your personal financial statement is the most important. It is the scorecard. We do a lot of things month to month, make money, spend money, hopefully save some money. All of those things that go into our monthly budget, if we want to step back from, the intensity of all of those day-to-day decisions and say, oh, fine, I'm doing all these things with my budget. I'm trying to make smart decisions. What's my progress? How am I doing? Your net worth statement, which is a statement of what you own minus what you owe. Hopefully the difference is positive. Hopefully you have a net worth, but if you don't, that's okay too. The thing about the net worth statement, even if you have a negative net worth, and we certainly did when I graduated from law school, is it shows you your progress. It shows you how you're doing, and that's so important. So again, that was podcast 114. Number 5, this was a good one. I interviewed Mark Kiner. He is a Social Security expert, and he gave us some advanced Social Security tips and strategies for those either, right at that point of deciding when do you take Social Security? If you're married, how do you work that out between spouses? And there are all these different sort of, in my mind, crazy strategies. It's like, why does this have to be so complicated? But Mark did a good job of sort of laying out those strategies and giving folks some tips. That was in podcast 119, one of my favorites for sure. Number 4, Alan Corey. Do you remember Alan? He's a kid. He's not a kid, but to me he is. $1 million by 30. He made $1 million by 30. He walks through how he did it. He wrote a book about it. So you can, of course, read the book. But in that interview, he talked about how he made $1 million basically in real estate in New York City. He's now back down in, I think, Atlanta, if I remember correctly. But that was podcast 104, and that was a lot of fun. All right, the third most downloaded podcast, 8 tips for black belt budgeting. This was sort of my effort of describing some tips to really take budgeting to the next level. I'm not, budgeting doesn't come naturally to me. I'm not someone who just naturally counts every penny and tracks it all. I find it painful. Maybe that's kind of a good thing because I suspect a lot of you do too. And yet I think it's so important. So I kind of walk through 8 tips that might help you, particularly if you're struggling. That's in podcast 106. Number 2, the second most downloaded podcast, how to stick to an investment plan. If I had to pick a single podcast for 2014 that I think was maybe the most important, it would be this one. This was podcast 118. And here's why. We all know we should stick to our investment plans. We all know we shouldn't bail out of stocks when the stock market crashes or jump into stocks when it's on a tear. We should have a plan and a well thought out plan, and we should stick to it. The problem is it's real easy to say, it's real hard to actually do. And we know that when people don't stick to their plan, they get scared, they jump out of stocks at the wrong time. They can really hurt themselves and their future goals. And so I tried to give some practical tips on how to actually do what to many seems impossible. And that's in podcast 118. And that brings us to the number one downloaded podcast. And this was interesting. This was one of my longest podcasts. And it was my interview with Joshua Sheets from Radical Personal Finance. This is podcast 123. Joshua is a certified financial planner who basically left the field and started a daily podcast, Radical Personal Finance, Joshua Sheets. And my interview with him got downloaded the most in 2014. And you can find that interview again at DoughRoller.net/podcast 123. So those were the top 10 downloads. What about the top 10 blog posts? And, let's look at them real quick. We'll start with number 10. And, it's interesting. We mentioned number 10 for the download was the 5-year rule on Roth IRA contributions, podcast 105. Well, for the blog posts, it was also a Roth IRA podcast, How Best to Use a Backdoor Roth IRA, podcast 40. DoughRoller.net/podcast 40. That article, the article that goes with the podcast, was the 10th most popular post on DoughRoller for this year. Now, I should say, I've been blogging since 2007, so there are a lot of older articles that were actually more popular than some of these, simply because they've been around longer and they just get a ton of traffic. But for 2014 articles that I published this year, How Best to Use a Backdoor Roth, podcast 40 was the 10th most visited article. Number 9, 20 ways to save money without pain or sacrifice. This was podcast 14. This was early in the year. This was when I was going through the 31-day money challenge, which some of you may remember. We love to save money. If we can do it without pain or sacrifice, all the better. Podcast 14, that was number 9. Number 8, Warren Buffett's asset allocation. He had an interesting comment in his letter to Berkshire Hathaway shareholders this past year. And I talked about it in podcast 41. And so if you want to know how Warren Buffett would invest money if he were investing in mutual funds and what his asset allocation would be, check out podcast 41. It was the 8th most popular article on DoughRoller the past year. Number 7, this was a fun one. The number one way to save money. This was podcast 130. What I did was I asked a question in my newsletter, and I asked folks, hey, what's the number one way you save money? And I got a ton of responses, and I walked through them all. And so there's an article and, again, a related podcast, 130, and that was the 7th most popular article. It was a lot of fun, and I appreciate everyone's responses to that. It's a great way as a community to learn from each other. All right, number 6, this kind of surprised me that this would be in the top 10. I'll be honest with you. It's a review of Future Advisor. Future Advisor is one of those robo-advisors or sort of automated investing services. And I did a review of the service on the blog. I didn't have a podcast related to it, just a written review. Again, the link to it will be in the show notes. That was the 6th most visited article. That kind of surprised me. Number 5, 100 ways to improve your finances. We talked about that one. That was podcast 100, and it was the 5th most visited blog article because they're all listed there. You can read it if you want. Number 4, this one surprised me too, but cheapest place to buy an iPhone 6. So iPhone 6s came out this year. I bought one, and I did a lot of research to figure out the cheapest way and did a podcast about it, DoughRoller.net/podcast 117. That was the 4th most popular article. Number 3, the 50-20-30 budget. This was from a book by Senator Elizabeth Warren, of course, before she was a senator. And it talks about this sort of very easy way to budget your money, the 50-20-30 budget. You can check that out at podcast 68. Number 2, the one and done method of saving money. This was podcast 13. This was during, again, the 31-day money challenge. I think a very important strategy to understand. It kind of goes along with podcast 14, where I have 20 ways to save money without pain or sacrifice. Podcast 13 is sort of the strategy, and podcast 14 are specific examples on how to use the strategy. So they kind of go together. But the one and done method of saving money, podcast 13 was the 2nd most popular article on DoughRoller. And the number one article, this is not a surprise. For the 31-Day Money Challenge, I put together an article that links to all of the podcasts that month. This was in January of 2014. And that article itself was the most popular article on DoughRoller of 2014, the 31-Day Money Challenge. Of course, that got published in January, so it had more time to receive traffic. And so it's not surprising that a lot of these came from earlier in the year. But I'll have a link to that in the show notes. And from that article, you can go to any of the 31-Day Money Challenge articles and podcasts. That was from, believe it or not, almost a year ago. It's hard to believe it. Man, time sure flies, doesn't it? So those were the top 10 blog posts on DoughRoller for 2014. Now, to some of your favorites, let me start with, as I said, I'm going to read three. I picked three email to read. I'm going to start with Niels, who gave me this idea. He wrote in, he said, "Are you going to do a best of 2014 show? I know it's subjective, but I would love for you to list some of the best tips you have offered in 2014 based on listener feedback. Here are a few of my nominations in no particular order." First, he mentioned Smarty Pig. So you can, if you're not familiar with it, and the name may sound a little strange, but you can just Google Smarty Pig. But it's a very interesting, creative way to save money. It is a bank, but it's with a bit of a twist. So you can check out Smarty Pig. Understanding expense ratios on investments. That was one of Neil's favorites. For that, probably check out podcast 28. There are a lot of expenses that relate to mutual funds. Expense ratios are just part of them. That's not all the expenses, but it's a significant part of the cost of investing in an ETF or a mutual fund, and understanding how that works and how they can affect your total return is critical. So I highly recommend podcast 28 if you're not already familiar with expense ratios. He also mentioned personal capital. That's sort of my favorite tool to track my investments and my net worth. You can check that out at doughroller.net/PC. That is an affiliate link. And then last, Neil mentioned the admonishment that all budgets should clearly tell you how much money you have to spend per month. If it doesn't do that, then it falls short of the intended purpose of a budget. And that's so true. I mean, the point of a budget in part is to help us make decisions. If you find yourself on the 17th of a month spending money and your budget has no influence at all on how you're spending that money, then what good is it? Now that, there's a lot of different ways to do it. And we've had a number of podcasts and articles on that, whether it's talking about different budgeting tools, different budgeting strategies or tips. But ask yourself, is your budget really affecting your decisions? Or is it something you kind of just track automatically, maybe through Mint.com or through Personal Capital or my personal favorite, YNAB, but you don't really, get your hands dirty and use it in any meaningful way. If you're not, then really what's the point of the budget? All right. Second email came from Lauren. She said, hands down, the most beneficial podcast of the year was the one on Social Security. Well, you've mentioned that. That was with Mark Keinerd, podcast 119. I learned so much, not the least of which was to engage a Social Security expert to help determine the best approach. A complicated issue that eventually everyone will need to deal with. Great resources mentioned in the podcast too. Thanks for the great year. I got to tell you, when I get to the age of Social Security, I'm absolutely going to hire an expert. I mean, even though I live and breathe personal finance and investing, there's just too much to know. And I'd rather pay someone a few $100 to give me the best approach for my wife and I, than to try to spend hours upon hours upon hours learning it myself and possibly just getting it wrong. So if you're at that Social Security age, a great podcast to listen to, 119. Lauren, appreciate the email. And then lastly, Jim, he said, I think my favorite podcast was the one on how to construct an asset allocation. That's podcast 25. It clearly explained what the point of picking an allocation is and also how to construct an allocation quickly and easily. And it is so important. Now, Jim went on in his email to ask, to raise an interesting kind of related point. He said, I think I'm late on this, but here's an idea for a future podcast. Valuation of the stock market as a whole and what it means. I just read The 4 Pillars of Investing based on your recommendation and really enjoyed it. It got me thinking about this topic, and I'm not sure I really grasp it. I get the concept that high valuations have lower expected returns, but how do you determine that valuation of the stock market? Is it predictive? If valuations are high, as I think they are now, what do you do about it, if anything? Well, that's a great question. and one that I'll devote a podcast to. But let me just, in a couple of quick minutes here, give you my take on this. The first is that Four Pillars of Investing is a great book. So if you were still learning, if you're sort of in that beginning phase of learning to invest, it's one of several that I would certainly recommend, the Four Pillars of Investing. In terms of stock market valuations, my view is this. Obviously, there are times when the market is more highly valued than others. We're in a period now, December 2014. The Dow just hit a record, 18,000. S&P 500 near record. We're definitely at the high end of valuations by, I think, any meaningful measure, whether it's the price to earnings, price to book, or whatever other sort of valuation metric you want to use. But here's the thing. I think over the course of investing for 40 or 50 years, there might be 3 or 4 times when the market is really, really out of whack, when it's really, really low, or when it's really, really, really insanely high. Probably only 3, 4, maybe 5 times over decades of investing. Other times, it's going to be in some pretty wide range of reasonableness. I think the market today is still in that wide range of reasonableness. It's not what I would call insane. It's what I would call high. Now, that doesn't mean it's not going to go down by 40% next year. For that matter, the market could be what most people would think is, based on historical data, an average price, and still go down 40%, right? If you'd asked me at the beginning of this year, 2014, would the market be higher or lower at the end of the year, I would have guessed lower, and I would have been wrong. I would have guessed interest rates would be a lot higher. I would have been wrong. So trying to predict the market in the short term based on where it is right now is, I think, impossible. By the way, people are making predictions all of the time. So what happens after something happens, the reporters go find the people who predicted it correctly and talk to them. And then the next time there's a big event, they find someone else, because the same people don't predict it right over and over and over and over again. And it's funny how they do. They try to bolster someone's credentials. Well, they predicted the housing crash. Yeah, so what? Who cares? If they don't predict it right all the time, they predict it right every other time, that's no good. You can't make decisions based on being right 50% of the time. And so I don't change my asset allocation, or at least nothing significant, based on the market. Now, again, if it's in an extreme, I might, but I think that only happens a couple of times in an investing career. And even then, I'm not going to make dramatic changes to my asset allocation plan. So, for example, my asset allocation plan today is no different than it was a year ago. I think I mentioned in podcasts before that I was slowly kind of moving from 80% bonds to maybe, 20% bonds to maybe closer to 25% as we get older. And we're in between that number right now. That has to do with our age, nothing to do with the market. And, I'm in no hurry to change that. So again, that doesn't mean the market won't go down by 50% next year or 20% or whatever the number is. It might. But I don't think we're at a crazy level where I would say, and even if we were, I'm not sure exactly what I would do. I certainly wouldn't go 100% bonds. And in fact, in today's market, you kind of got a tough decision because bonds are expensive too, which simply means yields are really low. So, even if I thought the stock market was crazy high, what am I going to do with my money? Go to cash? So in any event, I'm going to record a podcast in more detail on my thoughts about stock market valuation and other things that may influence asset allocation. But the long and short of it is, I have no idea what the market will do next year. Yeah, I think it's high by historic averages. I think most people would agree with that. I don't think it's insane. But I think it's high. And I'm not changing my asset allocation, but I could lose 10, 20, 30, 40% next year. We all could. There's no way to know. And if we do, by the way, I still won't change my asset allocation plan. But Jim, it's a great question. And it's, the thing is, and then I'll move on. Jim's asking the right question at the right time. The time to ask his questions is right now, before something bad happens, so that you're prepared for when the bad thing happens and you know how you're going to respond. The worst thing to do is to start asking those questions when the market's on its way down, because then we tend to make bad decisions. So Jim is absolutely right to be asking those questions now, and you should be too. What are you going to do when the market's down 30%? So, by the way, forget the 30%. Go look at your balance. If you've got $1 million, then what you really need to say is, what am I going to do when my account says 700,000? Am I going to freak? You need to ask that question now. Don't wait till it actually happens. Ask it now. All right, Jim, appreciate that. Great question. All right, so then I'm going to round this podcast out with my personal favorites. And I thought I'd do it this way. I'd do it by month. January to December, what were my favorite articles and or podcasts? And for January, it probably doesn't come as a surprise. It was just the whole 31-day money challenge. It was a lot of fun. I enjoyed doing it. I thought about trying to do something else similar to it in January. What I've decided to do, and hopefully I can stick to it, I'm not going to do any sort of 31-day money challenge or a podcast every day in January, but what I've decided to do in 2015 is to publish a podcast every single weekday for the entire year. Not the weekends, but the weekday. And I've got some help. I've got a small team together to help me do that. That's my goal. If you notice some hesitation in my voice, you're very perceptive. I'm a little worried about this. I tend to jump first and then look where I'm about to land second. And but that's my goal. So not doing a 31-day money challenge, but in some ways trying to do something bigger for 2015. But for January, obviously that was my favorite. For February, I did an article called Me versus the S&P 500. I will link to that in the show notes, but it was just comparing how my own personal investments performed in 2013 versus the S&P 500. You may recall that in 2013, the S&P returned just over 32%, including dividends. And no, I did not beat the S&P 500. I think I'm going to do that again, that same kind of article in a podcast early in 2015, because it's kind of a lot of fun. At least for me, I hope you enjoy it. But that was I think my favorite article in February. In March, it was The Power of Compound Interest. I did an article talking about the power of compound interest. I list that here because it's so important. Once you truly embrace the power of compound interest, it should cause you to make better decisions about saving and investing. And it's one of the reasons, by the way, I generally don't like the approach of paying off all of your debt before ever investing. I mean, if it takes you a year, 6 months, whatever, to pay off some credit card debt, fine. But when folks are saddled with student loans that will take them 10 or 15 years to pay off, plus credit card debt, the notion of waiting a decade to save and invest, I think is insane. Anyway, The Power of Compound Interest, that was in March. April. How long does it take to save a month's worth of expenses? This was another article that I think really kind of brings into focus how much you're saving. What percentage of your income are you saving? You know, if you save 10%, if you save an amount each month equal to 10% of your monthly expenses, just think how long it's going to take you just to save 1 month. Well, it's pretty easy, 10 months. And now I think that's just to save 1 month worth of expenses. And if your goal is to save 6 months, you're going to be doing it for a long time. Now, that's better than saving 5%, which is better than saving nothing. So I hopefully that article doesn't discourage you. I hope what it does is motivate you. I know that sort of calculation and thinking it through that way motivated me. So that was in April. How long does it take to save a month's worth of expenses? In May, my favorite was actually a podcast 63, The 4 Hidden Costs of Mutual Funds. You know, if you've listened to this podcast for any length of time, you know how important investing fees are, and they're not all about the expense ratio. So if you're not familiar with how mutual funds can cost us some money and the impact they can have on your nest egg, I encourage you to read and or listen. Read that article, listen to that podcast. Again, that you can just go to DoughRoller.net/podcast63, The 4 Hidden Costs of Mutual Funds. June, is your home a good investment? This was podcast 76. And what I did was I took the first home my wife and I bought. We bought it in 93, sold it in 2004. And I walked through all of the numbers, everything about how this turned out for us as an investment. I think some of the results may surprise you. That was in June, podcast 76. In July, podcast 94, 22 of the best tools to manage your money. I'm just a tool freak and enjoy using tools that actually simplify my life, improve my finances, improve my investing. And so I walk through what I think are 22 of those best tools to manage your money, podcast 94. In August, I started a series on dividend investing. The first one in that series I published in August, podcast 96. That was my favorite then. In September, what should you do with your 401k when you leave your job? That was podcast 111. And I think I liked that one because it's an issue that confronts most of us. I've dealt with it a couple of times now. What do you do with your 401k? Do you leave it at your old job? Do you move it to your new job? Do you roll it over to an IRA? And how should you think through those decisions? They're very important. Podcast 111, that was in September. In October, podcast 115, how to prepare your spouse to invest when you are gone. It's something that I've been working through because my wife does not handle our investments, has no interest in handling our investments. And so I've done a couple of things like consolidating some of our accounts, and now I'm looking at some of those robo-advisors for a lot of reasons, but this is certainly one of them. Would this help her? Should I get hit by a truck? So that was podcast 115. That was in October. In November, my favorite was 5 Simple Strategies to Stay Productive Working from Home, podcast 129. Those strategies have helped me immensely. I've become much more productive. And I'm still working on that. I've got more shows planned about productivity, keeping life simple but productive and fulfilling. And it certainly touches on finances and investing, but just productivity at your work, productivity really in all areas of your life. And to me, it's not just about getting more done. It's about getting the right things done. In fact, in some ways, it's about getting less done, but the things you do get done are the things that matter. Anyway, sort of the first in that series that I have in mind was in November, podcast 129, 5 Simple Strategies to Stay Productive Working from Home. And in December, my favorite was my interview with Krista Miller. Remember that? How a single mom of 3 is achieving financial freedom. That was podcast 135. She was terrific, and I just thought very inspirational. If you haven't listened to that podcast or read that article, and by the way, on interviews, I have the full transcripts on the site. So if you prefer to read it, of course, if you're listening to this podcast, my guess is you don't prefer to read it, but maybe you do. And you can check that out. That was, again, podcast 135. Well, there you go. This was kind of a good exercise for me because it forced me to kind of look back at 2014 and to see what I've accomplished, what I haven't accomplished, what you liked, what you didn't like, what seemed to resonate with folks, what didn't. And, we do these things like all of our work. It's minute by minute, hour by hour, day by day, but it adds up to something, hopefully something good. And I look at this and I think, okay, well, that was fine. 2014 is almost in the record books. What can I do better in 2015? How can I improve? What did you guys like? What didn't you like? One of the questions I asked in the newsletter a few weeks ago was, what topics would you like me to cover? And I've got, at least 30 or 40 podcasts planned based on your responses, and would love to hear from you again. So, if you've got more you'd like to send me, you know how to do it, dr@DoughRoller.net. I read and reply to every email. Would love to hear from you. Hey, hope you had a great 2014. Have a happy and safe. And look forward to spending some time with you in 2015. I will be back with the next podcast on January 1. Until then, remember, the best thing money can buy is financial freedom.